This is my true story. I woke up one morning with pain so intense I could not breathe properly. My legs would not move no matter how hard I tried. The bones felt wrong, like they had been shattered into pieces. I cried out for help for 2 hours, but nobody came to my room. The house was completely silent. I did not understand what had happened or why I was in so much pain. Then I started noticing things that made me realize the truth. Before I tell you what happened, tell us where you are watching from and please subscribe. The morning started with pain sharper than anything I had ever experienced in my entire life. The pain was sharper than breath itself, more intense than anything I thought a human body could endure. I opened my eyes and immediately knew something was catastrophically wrong. My legs felt like they were on fire and broken at the same time. The sensation was unbearable, and I could not catch my breath properly because every attempt to breathe deeply sent new waves of agony radiating through my lower body. I tried to move my legs to see what was wrong, and they would not respond to my brain's commands. They just lay there under the blanket, completely motionless and useless. The lack of movement combined with the excruciating pain told me something terrible had happened. I reached down with trembling hands and pulled back the blanket to see what state my legs were in. What I saw made bile rise in my throat and my vision blur with shock and horror. My legs were destroyed. The bones had been shattered like glass beneath the blanket. I could see unnatural angles and swelling and discoloration through my pajama pants. This was not an injury from a fall or an accident. This was violence. This was deliberate destruction of my body. Someone had taken something heavy and smashed my legs while I was unconscious and defenseless in my sleep. The realization made my heart race with terror. I tried to sit up, but the movement sent such intense pain through my entire body that I nearly lost consciousness. I fell back against the pillow, gasping and sweating and feeling like I might vomit or pass out or both. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. Panic was taking over my mind, but I forced myself to stay conscious. I needed to get help. I needed to call an ambulance. I needed someone to save me before I died here alone. I opened my mouth and screamed for help as loudly as my voice would allow. I cried out again and again, hoping someone would hear me. I called for my son, thinking maybe he had stayed overnight. I yelled for neighbors, hoping someone nearby would hear through the walls or windows. I begged the empty air for anyone to come and help me. My voice echoed through the house, but there was no response. Only silence answered my desperate screams. For 2 hours I cried for help without stopping except to catch my breath. I screamed until my throat was raw and bleeding. I called out every few minutes in case someone was finally close enough to hear. My voice grew hoarse and weak, but I kept trying because stopping meant giving up, and giving up meant dying. No one came. No one heard. No one answered. The house remained silent except for my increasingly desperate cries. The pain intensified as time passed. I could feel my legs swelling more, and the broken bones grinding against each other with every tiny movement. I knew I was going into shock because my body started shaking uncontrollably. I was sweating, but also freezing cold. My vision kept blurring, and I had to fight to stay conscious. These were signs of serious trauma, and I knew if I did not get medical help soon, I would die from shock or internal bleeding or both. I tried to think clearly through the pain and panic. How did this happen? I went to sleep normally last night in my own bed. I did not fall. I did not have an accident. I just went to sleep, and now I woke up with both legs shattered. Bones do not break themselves. This was not natural. Someone had done this to me deliberately while I was sleeping. Someone had attacked me in my own home while I was unconscious and vulnerable. But who would do such a horrible thing? Who would sneak into an old man's bedroom and destroy his legs with brutal force? Who would be cruel enough to leave someone suffering and unable to call for help? The answer was forming in my mind, but I did not want to believe it. I did not want to accept what the evidence was telling me. But as I lay there in agony, the truth became impossible to deny. The night before everything happened, I remembered my son visiting me. He had come to my house in the evening without much warning. He called earlier that day and said he wanted to stop by to see me. I was happy to hear from him because he did not visit very often anymore. Maybe once or twice a month at most. He lived about an hour away, and he always said he was too busy with work to come by more frequently. He arrived around 6 in the evening, and I made dinner for both of us. Nothing fancy, just a simple meal that we ate at my kitchen table. We talked while we ate, and the conversation seemed normal at first. He asked about my health and how I was managing living alone in the house. I told him I was doing fine and that I had no complaints. I liked living independently, and I was still capable of taking care of myself and the property. Then he started asking questions that made me uncomfortable. He asked about my will and whether I had updated it recently. He wanted to know who was listed as the beneficiary and how my estate was structured. I told him that my will left everything to him since he was my only child. The house and my savings and everything I owned would go to him when I died. But I also said I was not planning on dying anytime soon, so there was no rush to discuss these things. He said that was not the point. He said I was getting older and it was important to have proper paperwork in place. Then he suggested something that really bothered me. He said I should sign documents giving him power of attorney over my finances and my property. He said it would make things easier if I ever became unable to manage my own affairs. He said paperwork should go to younger hands because I might forget things or make mistakes as I got older. I told him absolutely not. I said I was perfectly capable of managing my own house and my own money. I said I was 74 years old, but I still had all my mental faculties. I could pay my bills and maintain my property and make my own decisions. I did not need anyone taking over my life. I told him when and if I became unable to manage things myself, I would address it then, but that time had not come yet. My refusal was firm and clear. He did not take my refusal well. I saw something change in his face when I said no. His expression went cold and hard. There was a look in his eyes that frightened me. It was not the look of a concerned son. It was the look of someone who was angry and calculating. His jaw clenched and his hands formed fists on the table. He asked if I was sure I wanted to refuse. His tone was almost threatening. I said yes, I was completely sure, and that I did not want to discuss it anymore. He stood up abruptly and said he needed to leave. He grabbed his jacket and headed for the door. I walked him out and he gave me a brief, awkward hug before getting in his car. I watched him drive away and I felt deeply uneasy about the whole conversation. Something about the way he looked at me when I refused had been disturbing. But I tried to convince myself I was overreacting. He was my son. Surely he would not do anything to hurt me over money and property. I went to bed around 10 that night. I took my regular medications and got into my bed on the first floor. I had moved to the first floor bedroom years ago because stairs had become difficult. I fell asleep quickly because my medication always made me drowsy. I slept deeply and heavily like I always did. I had no idea what was about to happen. I had no idea my son had not actually left. I had no idea he had waited for me to fall into deep sleep so he could come back inside. I did not hear anything during the night. I did not hear footsteps or doors opening or anything that would have warned me. I just slept peacefully until the pain woke me up in the morning. That is when I realized my son had done something terrible to me while I was defenseless. As I lay there in my bed, unable to move and screaming for help, I started to realize that something was very wrong with the house itself. The silence around me was not normal. It was too complete and too deliberate. I lived on a street with regular traffic and neighbors who were usually active during the day. I could normally hear cars passing by or people talking outside or dogs barking. But now there was absolutely nothing. The silence was oppressive and unnatural, like someone had made sure no sound would enter or leave this house. I tried to listen carefully for any indication that someone was nearby or that help might be coming. I strained my ears, hoping to hear sirens or footsteps or voices. But there was only silence except for my own ragged breathing and the sound of my heart pounding in my chest. The house felt empty, but also wrong somehow. It felt like a carefully constructed trap. I was alone and helpless, exactly where someone wanted me to be. I turned my head with difficulty to look at my nightstand, where I always kept my phone charging overnight. The phone was gone. The charging cable was still plugged into the wall, but my phone had been removed from it. Someone had taken my phone while I was sleeping. Someone had deliberately made sure I would not be able to call for help when I woke up injured and in pain. The missing phone was not an accident. It was part of a calculated plan to leave me isolated and helpless. I looked toward my bedroom door and saw that it was closed completely. I always slept with my door slightly open because I liked the air circulation, and I wanted to be able to hear if something was wrong in the house. But now the door was shut tight. I stared at the door and noticed something that made my blood run cold. There was a shadow at the bottom of the door, like something heavy had been pushed against it from the outside. The door had been locked or blocked from the outside to trap me inside this room. I thought about my dog, who usually slept in the hallway right outside my bedroom door. My dog was old, but he was loyal and protective. He always barked when strangers came near the house or when something was wrong. He should have been barking when I started screaming for help. He should have been scratching at my door trying to get to me. But I had not heard a single sound from him since I woke up. The complete silence from my dog was terrifying because it meant something had happened to him too. I realized my dog must have been locked away somewhere to prevent him from making noise. My son would have known the dog would alert me or the neighbors if something was wrong. So he would have made sure the dog was locked in the shed or the garage or somewhere far enough away that his barking would not be heard. Even the dog had been shut away deliberately to maintain this horrible silence. The more I thought about it, the more I realized how carefully this had been planned. The phone removed, so I could not call for help. The door blocked, so I could not crawl out of the room. The dog locked away so he could not bark and alert anyone. The house completely silent so no one would hear my screams. Every detail had been thought through. Every possible way I might get help had been eliminated. This was not a random act of violence. This was premeditated and calculated. I lay there realizing the full scope of what had been done to me. Someone had broken into my house while I slept. They had smashed my legs with something heavy enough to shatter bone. They had taken my phone and blocked my door and locked away my dog. They had created this house of silence where I would suffer alone with no way to call for help and no way to escape. They had left me here to die slowly and painfully. And as I pieced together all these details, one terrible truth became impossible to ignore. The only person who knew this house well enough to do all of this was my son. The son I had raised and loved and trusted had done this to me. He had tried to kill me in the most cruel way possible. After lying in agony for what felt like an eternity, I knew I could not just stay in bed waiting to die. I had to try to do something, even if movement was excruciating. I had to try to find help or evidence or anything that might save my life. Using every bit of strength I had left, I managed to shift my body slightly toward the edge of the bed. The pain from moving my shattered legs was so intense that I nearly passed out, but I forced myself to stay conscious. I had to keep moving, or I would die here. I rolled myself off the bed and landed hard on the floor. The impact sent shock waves of pain through my broken legs, and I screamed in agony. I lay on the floor for several minutes, unable to do anything but breathe and try not to lose consciousness. My vision went dark around the edges, and I thought I might die right there on the bedroom floor. But somehow, I stayed awake. Somehow, my body refused to give up, even though every nerve was screaming for me to stop. When I finally managed to open my eyes and look around from my position on the floor, I saw something that confirmed my worst suspicions. There was mud on the floor near my bedroom door. Fresh mud that had not been there when I went to bed the night before. I kept my house clean, and I would have noticed mud on the floor. This mud was new. It had been tracked in recently, and the pattern of the mud looked familiar in a way that made my stomach turn. I stared at the mud prints and recognized them immediately. They were the same pattern as my son's work boots. He wore heavy boots with a distinctive tread pattern that left marks I had seen hundreds of times over the years. He had walked through my house in those boots the night before when he visited, but these mud prints were fresh, and they led directly to my bedroom door. They showed that someone had walked from outside through my house and into my room while I was sleeping. The footprints told a story that was impossible to deny. My son had not left after our argument about the will and the power of attorney. He had pretended to leave. He had driven away to make me think he was gone. But then he had come back. He had waited until he was sure I was in deep sleep from my medication. Then he had entered my house using his key that I had given him years ago, trusting him as my son. He had walked through my house in his muddy boots, not caring about leaving evidence because he thought I would be dead before anyone found it. He had come into my bedroom while I was unconscious and defenseless. He had stood over me while I slept, and then he had taken something heavy and smashed my legs with brutal force. He had destroyed my bones deliberately and methodically. The son I had raised and loved and sacrificed for had turned into a monster driven by greed. He had decided that his inheritance was more important than his father's life. He had decided to kill me rather than wait for me to die naturally. The realization hit me with a force that was almost as painful as my broken legs. My own son had tried to murder me, the child I had raised from birth, the boy I had taught to ride a bike and helped with homework, the young man I had been proud of when he graduated and started his career. That person had become someone capable of sneaking into his elderly father's house and crippling him while he slept. Greed had transformed him into someone capable of violence against his own parent. I lay there on the floor staring at those muddy boot prints, and I felt something shift inside me. The shock and horror I had been feeling started to transform into cold rage. If my son thought he was going to get away with this, he was wrong. If he thought I would die quietly and he would inherit my house and my money, he was mistaken. I was not dead yet. And I was going to make sure he paid for what he had done to me. The anger gave me strength I did not know I still had. I knew I had to move, despite the unbearable pain, if I wanted any chance of survival. Lying on the bedroom floor was not going to save me. I needed to get to something that could help me call for help or document what had happened. I looked around the room from my position on the floor, trying to figure out what I could reach. My bedroom desk was against the far wall about 10 feet away. If I could get to the desk, there might be something useful there. Maybe a pen and paper to write down what happened, maybe something I could use to make noise that neighbors would hear. I started dragging myself across the floor using my arms and my upper body strength. Every inch of movement was agony. My shattered legs dragged behind me, useless and screaming with pain. I had to stop every few seconds to catch my breath and fight back the darkness that kept threatening to take over my vision. My body wanted to give up and pass out, but my mind refused to let that happen. I kept thinking about my son and what he had done, and the rage kept me conscious and moving. Blood started trailing on the tiles behind me as I crawled. The broken bones in my legs were causing internal bleeding, and the trauma was more severe than I had realized. I could see the blood smearing across my clean floor, and I knew I was in worse condition than I thought. I was losing blood and going into shock, and I probably did not have much time left. But I kept dragging myself forward inch by painful inch. I refused to die without fighting back. I refused to let my son win. Every movement burned like fire through my entire body. My arms shook with exhaustion as I pulled myself forward. My hands were slipping in my own blood, making it harder to get traction on the smooth tile floor. My breathing was coming in short gasps, and I could feel my heart racing irregularly in my chest. My body was shutting down from trauma and blood loss, but anger kept me alive and moving. Fury at what my son had done gave me strength that should not have been possible. I thought about my son inheriting my house after murdering me. I thought about him selling my property and spending my money as if he had earned it. I thought about him living comfortably off the proceeds of patricide. The thought made me sick with rage. I swore to myself that I would never let him inherit a single cent from the man he had tried to kill. I swore that if I survived this, I would make sure he got nothing but prison time. The anger was pure and cold, and it kept my mind focused through the pain. It took me almost 30 minutes to drag myself the 10 feet to my desk. By the time I reached it, I was barely conscious. My vision was tunneling, and I could feel myself starting to slip away. But I forced my arm up and grabbed the edge of the desk. I pulled myself slightly higher so I could see the desktop. There were papers scattered across the surface. There was a pen holder with pens inside. And most importantly, there was my tablet device that I sometimes used for email and browsing the internet. I grabbed the tablet with shaking, blood-covered hands. I pressed the power button and prayed it had battery charge left. The screen lit up and I nearly cried with relief. The battery showed 30% charge. That was enough. I could use this to call for help. I could use this to document what my son had done. I could use this to make sure he did not get away with attempted murder. My fingers were slippery with blood, but I managed to navigate to the emergency call function. Before I called anyone, I used the tablet camera to take photos of my destroyed legs. I took photos of the muddy boot prints on my floor. I took photos of the blood trail from my bed to the desk. I documented everything while I still had consciousness. If I died before help arrived, at least there would be evidence. At least my son would not be able to claim this was an accident. The photos would tell the truth, even if I could not. With trembling, bloody fingers, I managed to dial emergency services on my tablet. The call connected after 2 rings, and a dispatcher's voice came through the speaker, asking what my emergency was. I tried to speak, but my voice came out as barely more than a whisper. My throat was raw from screaming for hours, and I was weak from blood loss and shock. I forced the words out, telling the dispatcher I needed police and ambulance immediately. I said my legs were broken and I was bleeding and I had been attacked in my home. The dispatcher asked who had attacked me and where the attacker was now. I hesitated for just a moment before saying the words that would change everything. I said my son did this to me. I said my son broke my legs while I was sleeping and left me here to die. The dispatcher's tone changed immediately, becoming more urgent. She asked if my son was still in the house. I said no, he left, but he might come back. She said help was on the way and to stay on the line with her. She said police and paramedics were being dispatched to my address right away. I stayed on the line with the dispatcher, but I was fading fast. My vision kept going dark, and I had to fight to stay conscious. The dispatcher kept talking to me, trying to keep me awake. She asked me questions about what happened, and I told her everything I could remember. I told her about the argument over the will. I told her about the muddy boot prints. I told her about waking up with shattered legs and no phone. I told her my son had planned this to get my house and my money. I heard sirens in the distance getting louder. Help was coming. I had survived long enough to get help. The relief was overwhelming, and I felt tears running down my face, mixing with the sweat and blood. The dispatcher said the police were pulling up to my house now. She said they would break down the door if needed to get to me. I told her the door might be blocked from outside. She relayed that information to the officers. I heard loud banging and then the sound of my front door being forced open. Heavy footsteps rushed through my house. Police officers and paramedics found me on the floor next to my desk, covered in blood with my legs twisted at unnatural angles. They immediately started treating me and asking questions. I told them everything while they worked. I told them about my son and the argument and the boot prints. I told them to look at the photos I had taken on my tablet. I told them to check for the muddy boots and document everything. More police arrived and started processing my house as a crime scene. They photographed the boot prints and took samples of the mud. They documented the blocked door and my missing phone. They took my tablet as evidence after downloading the photos I had taken. They treated my bedroom as an attempted murder scene because that is exactly what it was. My son had tried to murder me in my own bed, and the evidence was everywhere. The paramedics stabilized me as much as they could before moving me. They said my injuries were severe and I needed immediate surgery. Both legs had multiple fractures, and there was significant internal damage. They said I was lucky to be alive, given how much blood I had lost. They carefully moved me onto a stretcher, and I screamed in pain despite the medications they had given me. They rushed me out to the ambulance with police officers following to take my statement at the hospital. As they loaded me into the ambulance, I saw neighbors standing outside watching. Word was spreading quickly that something terrible had happened. Police cars and an ambulance outside my house with officers treating it as a crime scene. People were talking and pointing and looking shocked. My son's reputation in the community was about to be destroyed along with his freedom. He had thought he could get away with murder, but he had been wrong. Justice was coming for him, and it would be swift and severe. While I was being rushed to the hospital for emergency surgery, the police immediately began a full investigation into what had happened to me. Detectives were assigned to the case, and they treated it as an attempted murder from the beginning. They had my statement. They had the physical evidence from my house. They had the photos I had taken documenting my injuries and the boot prints. They had everything they needed to build a strong case, but they needed to move quickly before my son realized he had been caught. Detectives went to my son's house that same day to question him. They did not tell him initially what they were investigating. They just said they needed to ask him some questions about his father. My son apparently acted shocked and concerned when they arrived. He asked if something had happened to me. He played the role of the worried son perfectly. He asked if I was okay and whether I had fallen or had a medical emergency. His performance was convincing, but the detectives were not fooled. They asked him when he had last seen me. He said he had visited me the night before for dinner, but left around 8 in the evening to go home. He said I had seemed fine when he left. The detectives asked if he had gone back to my house after leaving. He said no, he had driven home and stayed there all night. He said he could prove it because his wife was home with him. Every word out of his mouth was a lie, and the detectives knew it. Then the detectives told him why they were really there. They said I had been found that morning with both legs shattered and that I was claiming he had done it. They said it appeared to be attempted murder. My son's face went pale, and his expression changed from fake concern to real panic. He said that was insane and that I must be confused or having delusions. He said he would never hurt me. He said maybe I had fallen and was blaming him because of our argument about the will. The detectives asked if they could search his house and his car. My son hesitated and said he wanted to call a lawyer first. That was a mistake because it made him look guilty. The detectives said they could get a warrant if necessary, but it would be easier if he cooperated. My son refused and said he wanted his lawyer present. So the detectives left and immediately got a search warrant from a judge. They returned a few hours later with the warrant and a full forensic team. They searched his room and his car and his garage looking for evidence. They found his work boots in his car trunk. The boots had mud on them that matched the mud from my bedroom floor. The tread pattern matched the prints perfectly. The boots were immediately seized as evidence. They also found clothing in his laundry that had my blood on it. He had tried to wash the clothes, but forensic testing found traces of blood that matched my DNA. The physical evidence was damning and undeniable. But the most damning evidence came from his computer and his phone. Detectives found emails on his laptop where he had been communicating with a real estate buyer about selling my house. The emails were dated weeks before the attack. In them, my son discussed getting the property soon and asked for a valuation. He told the buyer he would have access to the house within a few months. He had been planning this for weeks, and the emails proved premeditation. They also found messages on his phone to a lawyer asking about how power of attorney worked and whether it could be challenged. He had been researching how to take control of my assets. There were search history entries on his computer about how to make injuries look like accidents. He had Googled things like how to stage a fall and can elderly people survive broken legs and how long before someone is found dead in their home. The digital evidence showed he had planned every detail of my murder. The evidence was overwhelming: the muddy boots, the bloody clothing, the emails about selling my house, the messages about power of attorney, the internet searches about staging deaths. Everything pointed to premeditated attempted murder, motivated by greed. My son had left a trail of evidence because he had been arrogant enough to think he would get away with it. The police arrested my son 2 days after the attack. They showed up at his house early in the morning with multiple officers and detectives. They had an arrest warrant charging him with attempted murder, aggravated assault, and elder abuse. When they knocked on his door and he opened it, they immediately placed him in handcuffs. They read him his rights while his wife and children watched from inside the house. His wife was crying and asking what was happening. His children looked terrified seeing their father being arrested. My son tried to protest and claim this was all a misunderstanding. He said I was confused and did not know what I was saying. He said I was old and probably having memory problems. He insisted he had not done anything wrong and that the police were making a terrible mistake. But the detectives calmly listed all the evidence they had found. The muddy boots that matched the prints in my bedroom. The bloody clothing he had tried to wash. The emails about selling my house before I was even dead. The internet searches about staging accidents and elderly deaths. His face turned white as they listed each piece of evidence. He realized they had everything. He realized his plan had failed completely. He had thought he would get away with murder, but instead he had left evidence everywhere. His arrogance and greed had made him careless. He had underestimated both his father's will to survive and the ability of police to piece together what had happened. Now he was being led out of his house in handcuffs while neighbors watched from their yards and windows. They took him away in a police car and drove him to the station for booking and processing. News of the arrest spread quickly through the community. People who knew my son were shocked to learn he had tried to murder his own father for inheritance money. The story was dramatic and horrible enough that local news picked it up. Within hours, there were news reports about a man arrested for attempting to kill his elderly father by breaking his legs while he slept. My son's name and photo were broadcast on television and published online. His professional reputation was destroyed instantly. His employer saw the news and immediately suspended him from his job pending the outcome of the case. His colleagues and clients learned that he was charged with attempted murder of his own parent. Nobody wanted to be associated with someone accused of such a heinous crime. His career that he had worked years to build collapsed in a single day because of his greed and violence. His personal life fell apart just as quickly. His wife filed for divorce within a week of his arrest. She said she could not stay married to someone who would do such a terrible thing. She said she was horrified and disgusted by what he had done. She took their children and moved out of the house. She told people she had no idea he was capable of such violence and cruelty. Whether that was true or not, I do not know, but she made sure to distance herself from him as quickly as possible. His friends abandoned him. People he had known for years stopped answering his calls and messages. Nobody wanted to be seen supporting someone accused of trying to murder his elderly father for money. The few people who initially thought there might be some misunderstanding changed their minds when they saw the evidence. The muddy boot prints, the bloody clothes, the emails planning to sell my house, the internet searches about how to stage deaths. The evidence was too strong to deny or explain away. My son sat in jail, unable to make bail, because the judge considered him a danger to me and potentially to others. He had shown a willingness to commit violent, premeditated acts against a vulnerable elderly person. The judge said anyone capable of smashing their own father's legs while he slept could not be trusted to follow bail conditions. So my son remained locked up awaiting trial while his entire life crumbled around him. The man who had been so desperate for my money and my house that he tried to kill me now had nothing. No job, no family, no freedom, no future except prison. I spent months in the hospital recovering from what my son had done to me. The damage to my legs was severe and required multiple surgeries to repair. The doctors had to insert metal rods and plates to hold the shattered bones together. They said I was lucky to have survived at all given my age and the severity of the injuries. They said most people my age would not have made it through the trauma and blood loss. But somehow I had survived, and now I had to endure the long, painful process of healing. The first surgery lasted over 6 hours. The orthopedic surgeon had to reconstruct both legs piece by piece. He said the bones had been shattered in multiple places by tremendous force. Whatever my son had used to break my legs, he had swung it with the intent to cause maximum damage. The surgeon said it looked like someone had taken a sledgehammer or a heavy pipe and hit my legs repeatedly while I was lying helpless in bed. The brutality of the attack was shocking even to medical professionals who had seen terrible injuries before. I had 2 more surgeries in the following weeks to address complications and make adjustments to the metal hardware. Each surgery meant more pain and more time under anesthesia and more risk given my age. But the surgeons said the additional procedures were necessary if I ever wanted to walk again. I endured each surgery knowing that surviving and recovering was the best revenge against my son. He had wanted me dead, so I was determined to live and see him convicted. Physical therapy was excruciating. Learning to use my legs again after they had been destroyed was one of the hardest things I ever did. The therapists pushed me to move and exercise even when every movement felt impossible. I wanted to give up many times, but I forced myself to continue. I thought about my son sitting in jail, and I used that anger as motivation. I would not let him have the satisfaction of destroying me permanently. I would recover, and I would testify against him at trial. After 3 months, I was able to stand with the help of a walker. After 5 months, I could take short walks. After 8 months, I could walk with a cane. The doctors said my recovery was remarkable for someone my age with such severe injuries. They said most elderly patients never regain the ability to walk after trauma like mine. But I was determined and stubborn, and I refused to accept being wheelchair-bound for the rest of my life. I worked harder at physical therapy than I had worked at anything in decades. The pain stayed with me constantly, even as I healed. My legs ached all the time, especially when the weather changed or when I pushed myself too hard in therapy. I knew I would probably have chronic pain for the rest of my life. The damage my son had inflicted would never completely heal, but I also felt a quiet satisfaction in my survival. I had beaten him. He had tried to kill me for my house and my money, and he had failed. I was alive and recovering while he rotted in jail awaiting trial. The satisfaction of survival and knowing justice was coming made the pain bearable. Every ache in my legs reminded me that I had won. Every difficult step I took with my walker was proof that my son had failed. He had destroyed my body, but not my will. He had broken my bones, but not my spirit. I had survived his attempt to murder me, and now I would make sure he paid the full price for what he had done. During my recovery, the prosecutors kept me updated on the case against my son. They said the evidence was overwhelming, and they expected a conviction on all charges. They said my son would likely spend the rest of his life in prison. They asked if I would be willing to testify at trial, and I said absolutely yes. I wanted to look my son in the eye in court and tell everyone what he had done to me. I wanted him to see that I had survived, and that his greed had destroyed his own life instead of mine. My son went to trial 8 months after he tried to murder me. By that time, I had recovered enough to attend the trial in person. I walked into the courtroom using my cane with visible scars on my legs and pain in every step. I wanted the jury to see exactly what my son had done to me. I wanted them to see an elderly man who had been crippled by his own child's greed. The impact of seeing me struggle to walk was powerful, and I could see it registering on the jurors' faces. The prosecution presented all the evidence systematically. The muddy boot prints that matched my son's work boots perfectly. The bloody clothing found in his laundry. The emails discussing selling my house before I was dead. The text messages researching power of attorney. The internet search history showing he had looked up how to stage accidents and whether elderly people survive broken legs. The photos I had taken of my shattered legs and the blood trail across my bedroom floor. Every piece of evidence pointed to premeditated attempted murder. I testified for over 2 hours about what happened. I described our argument about the will and the cold look in my son's eyes when I refused to sign over power of attorney. I described waking up in unbearable pain with destroyed legs. I described screaming for help for 2 hours with no one coming. I described realizing my phone was gone, and my door was blocked, and my dog was locked away. I described dragging myself across the floor through my own blood to reach my tablet. I looked directly at my son while I testified, and he could not meet my eyes. My son's defense attorney tried to argue that I was confused or mistaken. He suggested that maybe I had fallen during the night and did not remember it correctly. He suggested that maybe my son had visited earlier in the evening, but someone else had attacked me later. But the evidence made those arguments impossible to believe. The boot prints were my son's. The blood was on my son's clothing. The emails planning to sell my house were from my son's computer. The jury saw through the desperate defense attempts immediately. The jury deliberated for less than 3 hours before returning with guilty verdicts on all counts. Attempted murder, aggravated assault, elder abuse. The judge scheduled sentencing for 2 weeks later. My son sat there emotionless as the verdicts were read. His face was blank, like he could not process what was happening. He had gambled everything on killing me for inheritance, and he had lost completely. Now, he would spend decades in prison for his greed and cruelty. At sentencing, the judge gave my son 25 years in prison with no possibility of parole for at least 15 years. The judge said the crime was particularly heinous because it involved a son attacking his vulnerable elderly father while he slept. The judge said the premeditation and cruelty showed a complete lack of humanity. The judge said my son deserved the maximum sentence, and that is what he received. My son was led away in chains to begin serving his sentence. I watched him go, knowing I would likely never see him again. I changed my will immediately after the trial. My son was removed completely as beneficiary. Everything I own will go to charity when I die. My house that he tried to kill me for will be sold, and the proceeds donated to organizations helping elderly abuse victims. He will never inherit a single cent from me. He broke my legs for the house I built, but it was not my bones that ruined him. It was his own greed that destroyed his life. I live now with chronic pain and limited mobility, but I also live with peace, knowing justice was served. My son is in prison where he belongs. The house he wanted so badly will help other elderly victims instead of enriching him. Every day I wake up in pain, I am reminded that I survived and he lost. He tried to take my life for land and money. Now he has neither. He has nothing but a prison cell and decades of regret. Some wounds heal and some do not, but justice is permanent. That is enough for me.